Our scripture this morning is from the prophet Ezekiel, the first chapter, and settle in because it's the whole first chapter. If you'd like to follow along, you will find it on page 672 of your Bibles. In the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I was among the exiles by the river Chebar, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim, the word of the Lord came to the priest Ezekiel, son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the river Chebar, and the hand of the Lord was on him there. As I looked, a stormy wind came out of the north, a great cloud with brightness around it and fire flashing forth continually, and in the middle of the fire, something like gleaming amber. In the middle of it was something like 4 living creatures. This was their appearance. They were of human form. Each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the soles of a calf's foot, and they sparkled like burnished bronze. Under the wings, on their 4 sides, they had human hands, and the 4 had their faces and their wings thus. Their wings touched one another. Each of them moved straight ahead without turning as they moved. As for the appearance of their faces, the 4 had the face of a human being, the face of a lion on the right side, the face of an ox on the left side, and the face of an eagle. Such were their faces. Their wings were spread out above. Each creature had 2 wings, each of which touched the wing of another, while 2 covered their bodies. Each moved straight ahead. Wherever the Spirit would go, they went, without turning as they went. In the middle of the living creatures, there was something that looked like burning coals of fire, like torches moving to and fro among the living creatures. The fire was bright, and lightning issued from the fire. The living creatures darted to and fro like a flash of lightning. As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the earth beside the living creatures, one for each of the 4 of them. As for the appearance of the wheels and their construction, their appearance was like the gleaming of beryl. And the 4 had the same form, their construction being something like a wheel within a wheel. When they moved in any of the 4 directions without veering as they moved. Their rims were tall and awesome, for the rims of all 4 were full of eyes all around. When the living creatures moved, the wheels moved beside them, and when the living creatures rose from the earth, the wheels rose. Wherever the Spirit would go, they went, and the wheels rose with them. For the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. When they moved, the others moved. When they stopped, the others stopped. And when they rose from the earth, the wheels rose along with them, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. Over the heads of the living creatures, there was something like a dome, shining like crystal spread out above their heads. Under the dome, their wings were stretched out straight toward one another, and each of the creatures had 2 wings covering its body. When they moved, I heard the sound of their wings like the sound of mighty waters, like the thunder of the Almighty, a sound of tumult like the sound of an army. When they stopped, they let down their wings. And there came a voice from above the dome over their heads. When they stopped, they let down their wings. And above the dome over their heads, there was something like a throne, in appearance like sapphire, and seated above the likeness of a throne was something that seemed like a human form. Upward from what appeared like the loins, I saw something like gleaming amber, something that looked like fire enclosed all around. And downward from what looked like the loins, I saw something that looked like fire, and there was splendor all around. Like the bow in a cloud on a rainy day, such was the appearance of the splendor all around. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell on my face, and I heard the voice of someone speaking. This is the holy word.
Many of you have visited the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. I've heard some of your stories of your visits there. I visited for the first time in April while attending the annual gathering of the Alliance of Baptists in Washington. If you're not familiar with the museum, you begin your journey 3 levels underground with the beginnings of the slave trade. And you gradually make your way up 3 levels of historic material from the Middle Passage through abolition and Jim Crow to lynching and the Civil Rights Movement, all the way up to the rise of Oprah and the election of Barack Obama. But if you get through all of that and then you go upstairs 3 more levels to the very top floor of the museum, there's an incredible collection from African American contemporary history and art and culture. And it's on that floor that I encountered the UFO that sort of began this whole sermon sequence on the Uncanny. The photo I took of it is on the front cover of your bulletin. So take a look at that so you can see what it is I'm referencing here. It's hard to tell the size of this object just from that photo, but it's enormous, big enough to hold an actual person inside of it. The spaceship is called the Mothership. It was used as a stage prop by George Clinton and the band Parliament, or Funkadelic, P-Funk. Some of you know this group. 1970s, they played all the way through the 90s with this ship. The museum note explains something about this object. It says, the P-Funk Mothership is one of the most iconic stage props in the history of popular music. The Mothership delivered an unmatched visual spectacle for the audience and represented the spirit behind P-Funk's music. Figuratively, the Mothership emancipated the audience members and transported them to a plane free from racism and earthly constraints. It remains a symbol of the liberating power of music. I was so intrigued by this object and the note explaining its meaning that I went home and found a video of a Parliament concert where the Mothership landed. And I linked that video for you in this last week's e-newsletter. I hope some of you got to watch it. It's hard to get the deep significance of this shimmering UFO without seeing how it is used on stage. In the midst of their famous song, The Mothership Connection, the band and audience began chanting in a slow, rhythmic, funky style the lines, "Swing down, sweet chariot, stop and let me ride. Swing down, sweet chariot, stop and let me ride." And as they chant this line, the Mothership enters the venue overhead with flashing lights and pyrotechnics spraying flaming sparks across the stage. And it finally lands to the audience's uproar of excitement, and George Clinton comes out on the stage in his persona of Dr. Funkenstein. And in that moment, like a good Southern Baptist boy that I was raised with the biblical text deeply ingrained in his consciousness, I thought of the prophet Ezekiel. Now, the song "Swing Down, Sweet Chariot" is, of course, the prophet Elijah. You knew that. But the imagery is all Ezekiel here. As I looked, a stormy wind came out of the north. a great cloud with brightness around it and fire flashing forth continually. And in the middle of the fire, something like gleaming amber. In the middle of it was something like 4 living creatures. Each moved straight ahead. Wherever the Spirit would go, they went without turning as they went. The living creatures darted to and fro like a flash of lightning. I saw a wheel on the earth beside the living creatures, their construction being something like a wheel within a wheel. When they moved in any of the 4 directions without veering as they moved. A dome shining like crystal spread out above their heads, a sound of tumult. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of God, and I heard the voice of someone speaking. This is one of the most famous theophanies in the biblical text, and you all know what the term theophany means. We talked about it a few weeks back. It's a portrayal in the biblical text of God making the divine self manifest to humanity. Think of Moses in the burning bush, very classic theophany. Hebrew Bible scholar Margaret Odell says a theophany is a divine self-manifestation, and it is usually understood that such self-disclosures are perceived as eruptions into the natural order of things. Storm theophanies, like the one in this text, are common ways of expressing an experience of the divine in the biblical tradition, using images of clouds and fire and lightning and brilliant light. It's one of the most popular ways of portraying the manifestation of the divine in the Hebrew Bible. When you go home, you can read Psalm 19 to get another example of a storm theophany. Odell says because storms could be both destructive and beneficial, the imagery is at the same time terrifying and awe-inspiring, thus evoking emotions of fear and awe, and an impetus toward both attraction and dread. Some UFOologists, didn't know that was a thing, did you? Some UFOologists suggested that what Ezekiel was describing in this opening scene was not simply a theophany, but an encounter with an ancient extraterrestrial spacecraft. And in the early 1970s, Joseph F. Blumrich, who was chief of NASA's Systems Layout Branch in the Program Development Office at the Marshall Space Flight Center, set out to prove the utter ridiculousness of this notion. But as he examined Ezekiel's vision, he became convinced that he was in fact in the wrong and that Ezekiel had seen a spacecraft. He developed detailed drawings of the spacecraft and theories concerning the technology that may have been in use by these ancient aliens. And in 1974, he published a book by the title, The Spaceships of Ezekiel. Even more interestingly, from Ezekiel's description of the wheels within the wheels, moving in any of the 4 directions without veering as they moved, Blumrich developed a wheel design capable of rotating forward and backward as well as sideways, and patented the design that is now known as the Omni wheel, that is used in various applications of robotics and things like the freight decks of airplanes that need to move freight in any direction in order to pack it in there. And because of the design's origin, it's still sometimes jokingly referred to as Ezekiel's wheel. And through all of this exploration, I remembered that several months back, maybe upwards of a year or so ago, I came across a New York Times article about an archaeological discovery in Maryland showing the use of the Ezekiel wheel imagery in the spiritual lives of enslaved Africans. In fact, the symbol introduced to them by preachers sent to evangelize them was used as a nexus point connecting the slaves' traditional religious belief systems from West Central Africa and their new developing Christian religious practices. One of the powerful Bakongo symbols brought with them from Africa was the cosmogram, a circle with an X in it. And the archaeologists who discovered this finding in Maryland believed that they were fusing the cosmogram with the image of Ezekiel's blazing chariot wheel. And one of the archaeologists said that this symbol represented the universe and the path we travel through this world and the afterlife, and stands for the enduring connection between this world and the next, the power from above and below. all this symbolism bound up yet again in one of the most popular spirituals in the African Methodist Episcopal tradition, on the Eastern Shore at least. Ezekiel saw the wheel. This was a powerful, profound image in the religious life of enslaved Africans. It's hard for comfortable, white, liberal Christians to get all of this imagery and their connections, storm theophanies and blazing chariots and African cosmograms and spaceships and UFO abduction imagery, and what any of it has to do with understanding the prophets of the Hebrew Bible or our lives in the world. But let me contextualize this passage we read this morning. A passage, by the way, that doesn't appear in the 3-year cycle of lectionary readings. So normally you would never hear this text of Scripture read in worship if we stuck exclusively to the lectionary. And this sermon, in fact, is the only sermon in the 6-week series of Exploring the Uncanny that veers from the lectionary to deal with a different text. Ezekiel's visions and oracles and prophecies take place around and in the years after Nebuchadnezzar's siege and destruction of Jerusalem, so 588, 586 BCE. Odell explains the context this way. Ezekiel is introduced as a diaspora prophet. He is among the deportees, and it is to them that his message is addressed. These communities were trying to pick up the pieces of their lives after passing through a terrible trauma. Their land had been devastated, the temple destroyed, many of their friends and relatives were dead, missing, or left behind, and they had to begin a new life from scratch. And suddenly, to the prophet in diaspora, a prophet witnessing the mass deportation of his friends and neighbors, the heavens were opened up, a phrase never used in the Hebrew Bible except for this passage. And there was a divine eruption into the natural order of things. Beginning 3 levels underground at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, you enter the story of black people on this continent brought here by slave ships that abducted them from their homelands, carried them on a journey lasting upwards of several months across nearly 4,000 miles, packed like cargo beneath deck with barely room to move. And as you ascend upward through the museum, you reach the Zenith, the P-Funk mothership, emancipating audiences to a plane free from racism with flashing lights and pyrotechnics and spraying flames sparking across the stage, all to the new rhythmic chanting of that old slave spiritual, swing down, sweet chariot, stop and let us ride. Swing down, sweet chariot, stop and let me ride. Why is it, you think, that after dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that was the point at which UFO sightings began to emerge all across the U.S.? Stories of flying objects in the sky and crashes in the desert and abductions aboard alien spacecrafts. Just last week, the Washington Post published an article titled, "UFOs Exist and Everyone Needs to Adjust to That Fact." Washington Post. And nearly at the same time, the New York Times published an article titled, "Navy Pilots Were Seeing UFOs on an Almost Daily Basis in 2014 and 2015. Susan Lepselter is an anthropologist who lived for a time in a small, poor Nevada town known as a stop for tourists on their way to prominent sites of UFO activity in the desert. She conducted an ethnographic study looking at the experiences of people in this town with UFOs and the mythology that has grown up around this location in the desert and the government installations that are just a few miles down the road. She noted the ways so many of these folks had experienced marginality in the larger U.S. culture alongside personal traumas that related to their experiences of UFOs, never judging in her study, never judging their experiences as either factual or fantastical. In fact, Lepselter herself had an experience in the desert when she was there that she describes as an encounter with an unidentified object in the sky. One person in the town she spent a lot of time with was Carla. Lepselter recounts, Carla sometimes said that only people who had gone through things in childhood were open enough to be chosen, to be abducted, or taken up and out of the banal realm of everyday life. The wounds of this life left you primed for something more than this shit down here. Other stories she encountered contain clear displays of anxiety about colonization and the earth, secrecy and theft, nature and loss, the vulnerable boundaries of the human body. Sometimes, she says, the aliens are forces of technology run amok. Since the beginning of American colonization, the genre of abduction narratives has circulated widely. The earliest ones, of course, not of UFOs, but of Native Americans abducting white women and children. As Lepselter says, an extensive body of scholarship has shown us that the captivity narrative expresses anxieties and desires about colonization, gender, and race. The genre has been compulsively produced from the beginnings of American colonization. She goes on with some very beautiful paragraphs. Ghosts always haunt us with the historical injustices of the past. Their uncanny presences hold open social memories that seep into the present and disrupt its attempts at narrative closure. The uncanny denaturalizes the familiar until the strange and the frightening lead back to what we already know, to what was meant to be completely forgotten. She says, sometimes a sense of injustice develops into a structure of feeling, one suffused with desire, betrayal, injury, and a sense of vanishing potential. And then sometimes the uncanny itself is the redemption, the something more, that part that escapes, the return of possibility beyond what you might have thought. Sometimes what comes into view is the simultaneous terror of and hunger for just being taken away. Swing down, sweet chariot, come and let me ride. Swing down, sweet chariot, stop and let me ride. White liberal Christianity has opted for an overcorrective disenchantment of our religious tradition. Nothing is coming. What we see is all there is. We must strategize and work hard and work some more in order to try to make things better. And if any sense of the divine comes into play, it's a warm feeling of comfort we get as we go on with our good work. But through that overcorrective disenchantment, we've often overlooked the power of the narratives and symbols and metaphors and possibilities that we've tried so hard to set aside. We lose our human capacity to recognize the sentience of nature, which isn't just a feature of many indigenous peoples around the world, as we talked about 3 or 4 weeks ago, but that is also a part of our very own scriptural tradition. Let the heavens be glad and let the earth rejoice. Let the sea roar and all that fills it. Let the field exult and everything in it. Then shall all the trees of the forest sing for joy before the Lord, for the Holy One is coming. And the heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims God's handiwork. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard, yet their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. Psalm 19. Or Romans 1:20. Ever since the creation of the world, God's eternal power and divine nature, irresistible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things God has made. Or the storm theophanies that the ancient prophets of old captured their encounters with the holy in the only language majestic and full of awe and danger enough to describe their experience: lightning and thick clouds and fire and brilliant light. Or experiences of the uncanny that denaturalize the familiar until the strange and frightening lead back to what we already know, to what was meant to be completely forgotten. And we've said, oh yes, those are fine symbols of something greater than ourselves, and we should appreciate these symbols. We've equated advanced Western scientific perspectives with the assumption that the earth is fundamentally dead, inert, and an object. And any perspective that speaks to the aliveness of earth or the cosmos we have deemed unadvanced, pre-modern, primitive, superstitious. But what if they aren't symbols at all, but divinely infused sentience speaking in language we haven't yet endeavored to understand? Or divine manifestations erupting into the natural order of things? A deportee prophet, Ezekiel, prophesying amid a people picking up the pieces in exile, dramatizes the sovereignty of God over the cosmos, simultaneously questioning the sovereignty of the conquering rulers and deporting despots. Slave religion, music, all the way up to P-Funk and Dr. Dre, who samples the P-Funk song, drawing on the imagery of something coming from above, coming forth to carry you home. UFO discourse in the desert Southwest, questioning the sovereignty of the state by positing that perhaps there is something beyond our own planetary hegemony that will dramatically relativize our assumptions of power and dominance. The sentience of nature, portraying the very real nature of the divine in storm theophanies, questions the sovereignty of the rule of anthropocentrism and all of our human-centered assumptions about our place in the cosmos. All of these things relativize the otherwise overwhelming monolith of sovereignty that seeks to suppress, oppress, deport, exile, and suffocate freedom, and they open potential for imagination to flourish and fuel projects of resistance and resilience, to remember things we have almost forgotten, leading us to redemptive possibilities beyond what we thought possible. With Ezekiel in ecstatic vision amid a people in exile, or with the slaves whose 4,000-mile, months-long journey brutalized their body but did not erase their memories of their ancestral religion with cosmic vision, with those looking toward the sky in poor towns in the Nevada desert in critical defiance of their government's sovereignty in the universe, with P-Funk singing, "When you hear seats rumble, you will hear your conscience grumble," as the mothership enters to a crowd in awe with its flashing lights and pyrotechnics spraying flaming sparks across the stage. All we can do is look toward the sky and sing, "Swing down, sweet chariot, come and let us ride."